Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us to the next Indivisible TX Lege Reader Corner. We are happy to be with you live on Facebook and YouTube. Reader Corner series has been an effort for us as organizers within Indivisible TX Lege to pick books that really help us learn and grow in the organizing work that we're doing within Texas, and especially with the Texas legislature. So for this month, we had chosen The Politics Industry. Let's see, this is a white book, so it may be tough to show on my screen here. And this is by Katherine, Gehl, and Michael Porter. I don't know if I said Katherine's last name correctly. But on this panel discussion, we have three organizers. We have Kirk Pate. Kirk, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Very well. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirk. Lauren Ortel. Lauren, how are you doing?
Hi, doing okay. Good to be here.
And Gina Simon, is that how you say your last name,
Yep,
Gina?
that is.
This recommendation of this book came from you, correct, Gina?
Yes.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. It was definitely a great selection. I think we're batting 1,000 in terms of the books that we have chosen. We encourage people to read these books. We haven't come across a book yet that we're like, don't read this. So definitely encourage folks to pick up their copy of The Politics Industry. We're going to dive into some of the content of the book, but we think it's definitely a book that can help you continue to grow in the work that you're wanting to do so that we can collectively change Texas into that better and brighter future that we're all hoping for. So first off, we're going to kind of just go around the Zoom room to talk about our initial impressions of this book, and just kind of share with that. Gina, would you like to start us off just with the general kind of impressions around this book, or what made you first choose it and things like that?
When I first read it, I think I saw the author was on, I think it was Rachel Maddow, and they were having discussion, and it motivated me to buy the book. And I read it first a year ago, and then I just reread it again. It was really interesting the first time I read it, it was a lot of the stuff I didn't know. I was kind of new to politics, and first time really understanding ranked choice voting and how cool it was and how it could solve things. And then the second time reading it, I knew more, and it was really good to reread it and get just a deeper understanding of politics in general. But I learned a lot from this book. I love her optimism, and I need that right now. So it was helpful.
Oh, thanks, Gina. Lauren and Kirk, which one of you would like to go next?
Have Kirk go next.
Thank you. From the author's standpoint, it's kind of interesting that both have meandered the political landscape for a while, and ultimately, to a large extent, maybe not finding satisfaction with involvement in particular groups, and where those groups just didn't seem to address the crux of the problem that these two authors have come to identify and define in the book. So it's a book about the politics industry and its components, which basically you might describe as a huge game that is rigged by the rules that the two major players of the game agree upon. And so it's they framed the problem, let's say, in terms of the politics industry, the major components or players in this industry, and how the system actually functions really well for the main players, but it doesn't function well at all for the public good. And so that's what the book is about. And then, of course, they get into some prescriptions about how to basically play the role of a third party, have us play a role as a third party to try to influence and change the rules of the fixed game. So that's how they're approaching this. It's not about fairness per se, or this piece of legislation or that, public policy issues. It's about the rules of the game, and that's the perspective from which they approach this, both in their analysis and in their prescriptions. So it's very, very helpful framing of this issue.
Thanks, Kirk. Lauren.
All right, I didn't want to go toward the beginning because I have a little bit of a diverging view. I wouldn't go as far as to say that I would say don't read this book. I learned some things, I agreed with some things, and I disagreed with some things. And I'll admit a part of that was from the beginning. So I listened to the audiobook, and I don't think it was either the narrator was necessarily one of the authors, but they said, the writers of this book represent the spectrum. We have one lifelong Republican and one former Democrat who's centrist. I was like, oh, okay. So they don't understand my views at all. Okay. So having that right at the beginning, I was like, all right. And so I do feel like the perspective of the authors is pretty different from kind of how I see like the underlying problems and some things that they didn't really touch on some of the key pieces of why things work the way they do. And I think, the authors just, were raised in the country that we were of, like, capitalism is good, white supremacy rules, but don't say it, and so, yeah, so I felt a little bit of that. And so there was a lot of me kind of like, about different things they were saying, but I did learn some things, and I think there's plenty to talk about. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely understand that perspective, Lauren. I think the value of this book is to really understand why people look at politics the way they look at it, and why politics is structured and functioning the way it currently is functioning. And I agree with you that it doesn't represent our values of what we thought we were taught that government and how we get to a representative democracy and things like that were supposed to be. And so I think that's insightful for people just to be, for that to be transparent for them. Like this is a marketplace. These are two competitors in this industry, and they have control over this particular marketplace. And there's a fundamental problem with that being, understood, as well as then pursuing solutions under that framework. Because it doesn't ultimately get to other areas that I think we are trying to achieve as a country, as a society, that there are limitations in their own perspective. So I think they do a great job in terms of giving some of the highlights of how politics works, how politics works right now. I think that's a great introduction for a lot of folks who are just frustrated and don't understand, like, why can't the person I elected do good for our community and do good for the values we all said we agreed on, and why I voted for them? I think the first half of the book does a great job in terms of just breaking that down for folks. But then I think the second half of the solutions, the authors are both constrained because they're still bought into pursuing solutions within a system that is fundamentally flawed. And so I think they don't quite go far enough in some of that, but still gives us a lot of stuff to chew on and a lot of stuff to really see, what are the extra pieces. And there are some solutions that could help, but there's a technical help, and then there's an actual adaptability system change help. And I think these are the two differences between how they talk about this.
Right.
So really excited to jump into this with all of you. We're going to highlight some key areas that each of us kind of lifted from the book that we want to definitely put some spotlights on. As we always share, we won't be able to share everything within this book during this time. We usually shoot for 45 minutes to an hour, and on a couple of occasions have gone longer. Apologies to the past panels for that. If you're watching us live, feel free to participate in the comments on Facebook or YouTube. ask us questions. We'll try to get to them if we're able to before it's over. And if you watch it post live, still put your comments. We can communicate with you in the comments section after this is broadcast. So Gina, I'm going to hand this off to you because you have a particular area you wanted to spotlight with this book.
Right. But I want to say, I really agree with your assessment that the first half of the book, what to me was just really engaging and riveting. And I learned so much about how things are broken. And I did not now, after having the experience that I've had in politics over the last year, I did not agree with their solutions, that I just felt like it was a little too optimistic, and it would be, cool if it could happen. But I thought they described the problems better than the solutions, and that the solutions were just basically two things: ranked choice voting and changing the money in politics, kind of those two things. And then at the end, join an organization and evangelize. And I was like, really? So I was hoping for more of a, but the thing that really struck me and is the whole parallel of the Gilded Age and how bad things got and how corrupt things became. And after Reconstruction, how the white supremacists were white supremacists, and they wanted to retain control, and that after the Civil War and Black people had the right to vote, things started to change, in my perspective, in a positive direction. And then I guess the whole partisan thing hit ahead, and then Rutherford B. Hayes became president, and then they took all the troops out of the South. They stopped protecting the Blacks to vote, and in Mississippi and South Carolina, the Black vote plummeted by 97%. And like, here's an example in Louisiana in 1896, there were 130,000 Blacks registered to vote, a little over that. But by 4 years later, 1900, there were only 5,200. And it's like, oh my God. And it feels like that's kind of what's happening today with the voter suppression. And I don't know that it's as blatant. Of course, there wasn't Facebook and there wasn't all the things that back then to target the Black voters that is much in your face, and they kind of mask it today with voter, and they say they're protecting the vote integrity, but it feels so much exactly what happened: corruption and money in politics. And then boom, they came back, and it took 30 years from the point of the worst of the worst, and maybe that's where we are. And it scares me that it would take 30 years to resolve things here in America. But, during those 30 years, the candidates were chosen by party bosses. So they thought the solution was primaries. So that's kind of, which is, they're saying, and I kind of agree that primaries are kind of a mess now, but they were started with the right intention. But, a lot of good things happened in the Federal Trade Commission. They came up with a lot of solutions that kept, they broke up monopolies and took away corporate donations in elections. And that stood from 1907 to 1970. And it's really funny if you see the graphs of a kind of party divisiveness. The money obviously has a lot to do with it. And I wish we could go back to that: no corporate donations in elections, because it just seems like at the root of everything are two things: money and racism. And it's heartbreaking. And it's heartbreaking to see that we kind of fixed things and things got better, and the equality and income equality was better in the 50s and 60s. Our education system was pretty much equal, as not equal, not perfect, but we were respected in the world for our education system. And it just feels like we're back in the Gilded Age of corruption, and the elite is thriving. And while, the rest of America is struggling and being suppressed. So anyway, I just thought it was really the way they described what happened in the history of it. But, and it just made me think of where we are today. And I guess I'll pass it off to Kirk, who is much more eloquent than I am.
No. No, thanks, Gina.
Well, one of the, I think the roles that the authors had for discussing the Gilded Age was early on in the book to basically make a case for things having gotten so corrupt that a will to change the system materialized and it resulted in certain beneficial changes. So I think the authors are early on are making the argument that change, even dramatic change during the Gilded Age period, is possible. So I think that's sort of a prologue for thinking about our current situation that you alluded to, Gina. And so don't despair. I think that's part of the role that discussion had early on in the book.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I definitely want to chime in on this comparison, which I think is an apt comparison. But I think what's frustrating is the willing sacrifice that we see is that society needs to have happen. Now, how many people need to suffer? How much humanity has to be lost? How much suffering needs to be done until enough of us are willing to say this isn't working, and we're going to commit not only ourselves to a march, but we're actually going to commit ourselves as citizens to be engaged to fix this. And it's so unfortunate, and people wonder, like, why do we learn about history? It's like, it's exactly this. The hope by learning history is that we don't need to do that. We don't need to experience the suffering again in order to be motivated, but that we can be informed and continue to encourage these kind of things to stop corruption and this kind of rampant abuse of power and things like that. I do find it interesting that it's the progressive era that came out of that, with the reforms, with things that started to move things towards improvement. And lo and behold, the other similarity is that it's people under the umbrella of progressivism that are trying to push things forward to have that improvement within our country, within our politics, within our governance, and things like that. And so it's just so interesting how people have maligned the word progressivism or progressive when
Right.
our history shows us that this is what helped get us out of that dark period.
Right. I know it's progress. It's the word progress. Progress is a good thing. When would progress be a bad thing? So how is progressive? It's just, semantics, I guess. But I'm proud to be progressive.
Lauren, just want to check in with you, see if you have anything.
Yeah, y'all have already covered a lot of what I was thinking, and what you said, Alex, about people questioning why we should study history. There's so much there that we can either see reflected today, or we can see those little turning points that really led to these bigger things. One of y'all mentioned the changes in Gina, you mentioned the changes in like corporate donations type of thing. Another thing was tax breaks for the wealthy, right? Like that started at one point. I don't remember if it was the 70s or 80s, maybe. I don't know. I tend to be able to blame everything on Reagan or Nixon. One of them started it. But then even, the Democrats have done it too. It just was this continual thing of like moving this direction, and we can look at those. Another year that's been coming up a lot, that, thinking about 2020 and this past year as well, and everything we've experienced and how overwhelming it's been, the more I learn about 1968, it kind of comforts me in a way to see there were so many similar issues in 1968, because the last 2 years have seemed so, especially like I'm only 34, like I wasn't around in 68. So for me, these last 2 years are just like, oh, this is completely, beyond anything we've ever come close to experiencing. And then so much of what I've learned about in just that year is connected. And so it's just fascinating to dig into this, to look at the history and see how it's reflected today, and also how we can learn about what are some ways we can undo some of this, because there were different points where decisions were made, and we can make the other decision, hopefully.
What is it about 68? Just curious.
Oh, all kinds of stuff. There was the big DNC in Chicago convention with all the policing attacks on the protesters was a huge thing. There was also some type of deadly virus situation, like intense virus situation, that I didn't know about until recently, and lots of people getting assassinated, and so a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and the last thing I think I want to tie in together what you said, Gina, was just racism being at the core of a lot of this. Money and racism, and ultimately why capitalism gets so much criticism is because it allows greed to become normalized.
Right.
We don't check capitalism, in terms of the way people pursue it, or people can pursue it. They will hoard as many resources as they possibly can, so they can do things like fulfill their dream of being an astronaut and building their own spacecraft, like we've seen some recent stories and things like that. And the fact is that money was not earned by them alone. It was earned by collective investment through infrastructure, through people's talents, through people's labor, and all of that kind of stuff. So this notion that anybody earns or deserves that much money, and that being a healthy form of capitalism, is absurd. And we're seeing this in terms of how much it hurts our society. And so government is there to protect the people so that capitalism cannot run amok and cannot be as toxic as we have seen it in the history with the Gilded Age, and as we're seeing it in our current modern time, and times in between. And so what is leading also that greed and that corruption is that white men want absolute power. And so white men wanting absolute power throughout American history has then motivated them to suppress and marginalize people who are not white men, including women, Black and brown communities, Asian communities, indigenous communities, everybody. And so this is fundamentally why the work that we're doing and how it impacts our work today is so important around us being inclusive, us being intentional with anti-racism, because anything that is not doing that is ultimately helping this corrupt system that's in place that benefits white men in the end of the day. So just you highlighting that, I think, was great.
Okay. Thank you. I feel that way. And when you said hoard, I thought conserve, conservative. It is like greed while we progress.
Right.
I don't understand the whole greed thing and the Gilded Age. And it's just like, why is, isn't everybody being happy? Why, how much money do you really need? And it just baffles me. I would so much rather have less money and have the country prosper than to have individually more money. I don't get it.
Yeah.
Well, each of you has mentioned something that provides sort of a segue into a topic I wanted to raise here, and it's the notion, the concept that the author raises about what she calls a duopoly. She starts by describing in simplistic terms what everybody probably understands as a monopoly, where, say, some business enterprise basically co-opts the largest share of a market and dominates it. And through its dominance, it controls entrance into that market it tries to satisfy its customers in all ways and adapt in ways to continually to try to satisfy those customers. Now, you might think that Facebook may be such a thing, has a large market, tries to satisfy its customers and so on. But from that basic understanding of, presumably everyone has, of what a monopoly is, she goes to the concept of duopoly, and she's basically talking about the Democratic and Republican parties who, since this Gilded Age and since national conventions of those parties no longer chose candidates at various levels, say state parties didn't choose candidates through conventions, everything, professional politicians and others, major donors, figured out a way to reconfigure the system so that they exercise control in a different way. In other words, they changed the rules in such a way that in something of a balance, the two parties control or make up the new rules that mutually benefit each of the major parties, whether at the national level, state level, and everything in between. So that's the duopoly that operates. It has a lot of moving parts. But one of the things that it controls, let's say, is through the rules. It controls who can actually file as candidates. How difficult can they possibly make it for new candidates who are not sponsored by, endorsed by those parties? How can they possibly get on the ballot? And that's addressed through some of the fixes that we'll talk about a little bit later. But that's a party control issue. This business currently, another characteristic of it is that the rules are constantly changing and being refined to further solidify each party's position in that duopoly. So if you think about, say, the election bills that have just been passed through the Texas legislature, you can certainly address those bills from the standpoint of the content of those bills and the likely results. But in a larger picture, say in the context of this book, it's about changing the rules to preserve the monopoly power of the party in power. Another interesting thing about the duopoly is, particularly on the elections side of the matter, as opposed to the legislating side of the matter, once people are in office, the process is rigged in such a way that there is almost a total disconnect between running for office and being elected, and then legislating in a way that actually benefits the common good. There's almost a total disconnect there. So that's another major characteristic of the duopoly. And so another way of putting it is the emphasis, once elected, is doing whatever is necessary to continue to be elected. The outcome that we might expect, having to do with the common good, letting Medicare negotiate for prescription drugs, there's that disconnect there. And so politicians are less, the system does not enable true accountability for, once having been elected, you actually perform in such a way as to produce a desirable result for the common good. So that's another major characteristic of it. And so, donors come into play in this, the media come into play in this, both sides of this duopoly tap those resources in such a way that even in a partisanship sense, even those resources as suppliers to the game, to the parties, even those are more or less locked in as well. So they command those resources in effect. because of the money that they pay out to data firms and so on. So, I found this notion of the duopoly particularly effective. And when you guys were talking about possible changes, and I mentioned earlier on that this book and the efforts or the prescriptions, however you want to characterize them, represent an outsider's attempt. They're outside that duopoly. It's an outsider's attempt to say the way to fix the duopoly and the command and control that it has is to figure out how to exercise an influence to change the rules of the game by which they operate. And that is a very huge slog uphill to do that. So I'm not, I don't come down on quite so hard on their prescriptions, because I think there's that reality staring them in the face, and that is that they represent an outside influence trying to change an insider's game that's dominated by two major players. Yep. So you all probably have thoughts as well about this duopoly notion and how it operates.
I was really, I actually voted for Ross Perot back in whenever that was, in the late 80s, 90s. And I was living in New York City, and he just was so different to me. And I thought, wow, this is so cool. And I thought, why isn't there a third party? And this book, and there's another book I read that helped me understand that after that happened, both parties came in and said, let's make it almost impossible, basically. It's like candidate suppression or third party suppression. So there can't be a third party. And I was just so disappointed, because there really should be a third party. I heard an interview or read an interview, it was last night, with all people, Matthew McConaughey, which we won't discuss, but he did say,
strike it from the record.
Yeah, what? Sorry, but anyway.
Strike it from the record.
Yes, okay, yes. But he did say there should be a third party. And he said, you know what, there is a third party, and it's called the majority. And it does, it feels like that there is a third party, but they won't let it exist. And when the author wrote, I feel politically homeless, I mean, I feel that way. I'm not far left, I'm not far right. I just want what's right and what's logical. And it's kind of like their prescriptions are logical fixes for an illogical, rigged system. But
at the level that this professional game is played, you talk about how tightly entrance into the game is controlled. Trump filed as a Republican. This way outsider guy. You hear some talk maybe of Matthew Dowd wanting to run for office. Republican, sort of Republican. If he's going to run? I mean, he may very well feel compelled to file as a Democrat. That's how difficult it is. And so and I think those are good indicators of how difficult it is to enter the game as an independent. Now, Ross Perot somewhat succeeded, but those who control the rules changed the rules to make it even more difficult for a Ross Perot to continue to play the game. That's how commanding control is by the duopoly.
We did it in our Texas legislature this year, didn't we? They needed a certain, like a 3/4 or something to get to pass. I forgot what it was, but anyway, they changed the number so it would be 2/3 instead of 3/4, so they would have what they needed to pass what they needed to. And it's just awful the way they do that and change the rules.
Yeah.
Well,
every legislative session, Patrick, changes the majority of senators that are needed.
But
whatever the Republican majority is, that's what it is.
Exactly. One thing to keep in mind, and the authors point this out, the Constitution as a written document is about this big, right? It doesn't lay out the rules. The parties have come to lay out and to define the rules by which the game is played. And that's what makes it difficult. The other thing that makes it exceedingly difficult is that in the business world, you have such a thing as antitrust. You can potentially break up monopolies. You know, there's some discussion nowadays about breaking up Facebook or Google. In politics, antitrust laws don't apply. So in a way, it's an unregulated game. It's an unregulated and
That's
fixed,
really interesting.
and
That's
fixed
really
game and fixed game. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece there, Kirk. That is a fixed game, and I think there's a lot of things that you highlight in talking about this duopoly, and I just want to share some personal reflection. One of the reasons I started organizing under Indivisible when it got created after the 2016 election. There's a lot of options to get engaged with different things. It could have been through the Democratic Party. It could have been through other grassroots organizations. The idea of what Indivisible was bringing to the table that interested me was a place of power outside of the party. Understanding that there may be alignment with the Democratic Party in trying to push for some progressive solutions, because our current day, the Republican Party has zero interest in doing any of that. And I don't know if they've ever had a lot of interest, period, but definitely there's not really room to be able to move within that space. Democratic Party has covered the marketplace for diverse voters more and more, for Black and brown voters more and more, and has at least had the messaging to convince people this is the place that these solutions can be made. But the Democratic Party has so many issues and has so much corruption in itself. We talk about Perot's race. I think a more recent version of that is, in a different attempt, was an independent Bernie Sanders trying to get the nomination for president, and the Democratic Party in both instances finding a way and saying, no, we won't allow you to be the nominee, no matter how many people want you, no matter, we're going to change the rules, we're going to change things. Kirk, when you talk about the media being an extension of these parties, and because of how much they feed it with funds, with political advertising, with all sorts of influence and things and access, we saw the media also play their part against his nomination. Now, folks may not agree with some of his solutions or his approach, and maybe feel like he's beyond them in some places, but a lot of his solutions are at the foundation of what a lot of progressive values are, where healthcare for all, as an example, and Medicare for all has become a much more popular item within America before he had run. So his candidacy has helped bring that to light, as healthcare reform needs to happen in this way versus how it's been happened previously. So I think just using that as an example, just talking about the recognition, a lot of people wonder, is Indivisible just democratically aligned because we criticize Republicans so much and we absolutely want to replace Abbott, Patrick, and Paxton because of how horrible they do in Texas, how horrible of a job they've done in Texas, including the failed electric grid and on and on and on. But the real pursuit is that we actually have representatives that are serving the people, regardless of party. And right now, the Democratic Party is actually giving access for that to happen. But reform within the Democratic Party needs to happen. And this just goes back to why I chose to work outside of the party infrastructure, because I felt if I worked within the party infrastructure, because of all the rules, because of all the BS that's there, I would spend 10, 20 years navigating, learning, working through that. And in the end, getting overtaken by party thinking and party politics thinking, that I wanted to keep this outsider's perspective and pursuing solutions to figure out what we can actually do as the people. And so this duopoly is very corrosive in terms of our politics. And so if I ever push for a candidate who happens to be Democrat, my goal is not for them just to support the Democratic Party, but to reform it and to reform politics as a whole. And going back to like Citizens United and corporate donations and things like that. And so it's a real constraint we have within this current system to actually advocate for change.
Yeah, definitely in the same boat, Alex. I have an aversion to, pure party involvement. And yeah, like you said, there's been a lot that the Dems have messed up and not really owned up to. And it's also just strange that a lot of, the things that Bernie was proposing, a lot of things that most folks agree upon are labeled radical, where in other parts of the world, it's like, wait, how is it radical that you just want the people in your country to have access to education, healthcare, and housing and jobs that won't kill them? So we've just gotten so entrenched in this that it's, ideas about how a country can actually take care of the people who live there has just been labeled like, oh no, that's radical. We can't talk about that. We're going to spend all of our time fighting about these other things. So it's really strange. I guess this can kind of segue into the next piece because Kirk, you were talking about outsider solutions. So we've got this duopoly, we've got this insider rigged game situation. And I was interested in these. So some of the things they talked about were top 5 primaries, where you're getting a lot more candidate options there. Ballot initiatives. So that's, the people saying we want to vote on these certain things, and we don't need elected officials necessarily to do it. It's like the people will do this. And then ranked choice voting. These are all definitely things I, generally think are good ideas, want us to move in the direction of these. But I did start thinking about examples of each of them. And it kind of made me question like, I wonder if even, these ideas need still some tweaking or something. And also thinking about, my measure of progress or changes that really are for the better might be different than other folks. So for example, with ranked choice voting, we saw that we have that in some places. They have it in for some things in New Mexico. There's been talk about getting it, usually starts at the local level in Texas. Austin has been trying. I don't know the latest on where that's looking. But we saw in New York City, the mayoral race there, ranked choice. And, there may have been some grumbling about how it took extra time to get to the end result, which for me, that wasn't a huge deal from my perspective. But also I'm not a New Yorker. So this is someone looking at what happened over there and thinking about it, and also being disappointed in the end result, because one of my measures for progress is, are we dismantling systemic racism and white supremacy in this country, or are we still stuck in that with the changes we're making? And so for me, the outcome of that is kind of, a yes, let's further embrace law enforcement and, kind of this approach and the institutions that uphold slavery. So I was like, oh, okay, so maybe that's not, the silver bullet, if we can still get to that. And I think it's just that we're so entrenched in this, and it's so much the heart of everything in our country, that even when we're making progress, it's still, on the back of these systems that ranked choice voting might not be able to get us to break away from, but maybe I still want to see it more and more examples. Looking at ballot initiatives in Austin, we've had some bad ballot initiatives. So the most recent one from the past election was Prop B, which is, we've got a lot of people who don't have housing. They are living on the streets and suffering. And that made a lot of people mad, and they wanted to punish those people. And so Prop B was, we're going to recriminalize your poverty. We don't want to see you. We want you disappeared. And it won, so it was the people and their rage at seeing poverty created something. And so I was like, oh, okay. So that was a people, outsiders solution that had a really harmful outcome. And now they're taking it to the next level with Prop A of, oh, and now we want to switch a lot of our city's funding to just more policing. We want cops everywhere. We want to just go all in on law enforcement and forget about other things, parks, libraries, things that people enjoy and need.
Affordable housing.
Yeah, or housing, right? So luckily other folks are moving on the housing, but yeah, just not making that connection and just being so fueled by racism that they're able to get enough folks who buy into those messages. And so those are some examples that came to mind on these solutions. And so I just, we got to tackle the big piece underneath so that these solutions have more opportunity for change, I think.
Did you find their solutions just way too optimistic, or what? Yeah, just curious.
Yeah, I guess, I was familiar with most of them. I didn't know the thing about Nebraska, and, just having the one chamber. And I did like the idea about how they were saying, we need to break away from this, like the majority party and the speaker for that and the whips and, that part. So I was interested in that, that I haven't seen too many examples of since I wasn't familiar with Nebraska doing that. And so I was interested in that. As far as too optimistic, I would say, I think the other solutions that I mentioned that they pushed on the ranked choice voting, top 5 primaries, I think they are good ideas that are only going to take us so far when we're still stuck in the systemic issues that we have.
But
Yeah, and I think go ahead, Kurt.
But what you're pointing out, though, Lauren, is trying to deal with day-to-day issues, let's say, the urgency of dealing with the homeless issue in the context of other people trying to make major systemic changes. That's the messiness of it. And so from what I understand from the book, the business about the top 5 and then the ranked choice voting is 2 separate election approaches, provides a pathway for new entrants to run for office and be successful. And part of what's involved there is to affect the duopoly in such a way that more emphasis is put on what voters want in general, as opposed to what the money influencers want in the process. And so it's a very difficult paradigm to shift at the same time that you're trying to deal with those local issues that you're talking about, that where there's money behind it, still a whole lot of people didn't vote, and so on. And so it's a messy proposition when you're talking about major structural changes to the way the game is played, where those rules are trying to be altered by outsiders. At the same time, you're having to deal with those day-to-day crises. And so that's just part of the messiness of it.
Oh,
but,
yeah. Go ahead.
On the issue too of effectiveness approaches, I think the top 5 in the ranked choice voting probably have, there are examples of that, existing examples of that. That's on the election side. On the legislation side of it, there's 2 or 3 pages in there about have this big commission that investigates. I mean, so I thought, that approach was a little weak, and also the approach I thought was interesting about the zero-based budgeting, which seems to me totally at odds as far as the way I understand modern monetary theory. So that was kind of a non-starter for me on the budgeting side of this. I think that's a topic it's a different book, a whole different topic, but the business about balanced budgets and zero-based budgeting, when the federal government is the printer of our currency, everyone else is a consumer of the currency. seemed a little bit odd.
But yeah, there's so much here that I want to hopefully try to touch on as much as I can. So I think the top 5 primaries, what the opportunity there is that, we get rid of the partisan primaries and we just simply have the majority to be able to choose who's going to be in the general election. And that, I believe, can help a lot in terms of right now our primaries are being, this is the big fear, is that the fringes of either side are the ones who are threatening, we're going to primary you. And so then they try to respond to them, especially what we're seeing with the Republican side in terms of how, racist those primaries can be, how just backwards thinking, anti-science, all these other things that are happening is very, very dangerous. So that could help up to a certain point, like we're saying, though, because while that could help the majority get more invested in terms of who the top 2 candidates, it's not the lesser of 2 evils you're choosing, but potentially, you have 2 of the brightest options within your community that you're choosing. It's still within this system. So how's the system going to eat them up once they transfer from electoral politics to legislative, day-to-day stuff? We don't know. I think the opportunity is that we can create a tipping point. That's the goal, that we create a tipping point to where if enough communities introduce this concept and they have higher quality, representatives, then that can help change the dynamic of what's happening in Congress, in state houses, and things like that. But we know there's going to be an offset. So it's like being prepared for that offset and how to battle, because at the end of the day, the duopoly still exists. The duopoly still is going to want to change the rules to say, no, they're doing good things that we don't want them doing. So we need now to cut this off, or we need to change it and compromise them in a different way. I think another part that's not addressed in this is that our elected officials are elected, but they don't actually run everything. Yes, they're voting on laws, they're voting on budgets, but then the person who are delivering on those budgets is our government agencies. So, public education is a huge issue that the legislature and the governor and lieutenant governor can address and prioritize. But then they also appoint who's the head of the TEA, the Texas Education Agency. And the TEA is directly involved with the ISDs and creating rules and all these other kind of things. When we look at city politics, it's the city manager. Yes, the mayor and the city council are going to vote on certain things, but then who's that city manager and what they're doing with that money and how they're actually responding to the community. And so there's layers to the actual delivery of the services of government and the function of government that goes beyond these elected officials. And so this system, fixing who gets elected is just a part of the problem we have to solve. And I think this is where the duopoly, really going back to that, limits us, because it becomes so tribal, it becomes so surface level in terms of what we're fighting for. Like, we're not even digging into these bigger issues. Ranked choice voting, I agree, Lauren, the results of the New York City mayoral race were disappointing in terms of how that came to be. Not the timing issue. It's going to take time. Like, let's take the time. I don't care about that. But it was disappointing in terms of the results. And I think a lot of that was also because voters were not comfortable with the concept. They didn't understand how it worked. And so not only would we need to see it in more places, but we would actually need the time for people to learn it over several election cycles. The risk of that is that will the time it takes for voters to learn it be too long compared to the time it'll take for the duopoly and the politics industry to circumvent it and to subvert it? And I think that's always the issue we're fighting against. We could organize and get voters out. There's so many people who aren't voting, like we said, but the time it takes to finally get over that hump, what rules have they changed? What have they changed to make this work, to where all of our work gets undermined? Because we don't have time on our side. It takes a lot of effort to do this work, and they can change the rules because they're in power and they have a monopoly over the rule making, that we're constantly, the rugs being pulled out from under us as we continue to try to push for progress. Go ahead, Jean.
my cousins from New York City who were here visiting, we had this discussion this morning about ranked choice voting, and it wasn't the time of the election, and it wasn't the lack of understanding so much of how to do ranked choice voting. It was doing the research for the number of candidates, and that they were saying there's no resource in the city of New York that you can just go to or whatever and find and read a nonpartisan bio of each candidate, and then maybe yourself kind of pick and choose them. And it would be so easy with today's software and to build anything like that that could be used from state to state, where people could look at their candidates. Because I went through that too in Texas. Finding the information and finding who is my candidate, what have they done, and is this a partisan bio, or is this? So that they told me that their issue with ranked choice voting, and everybody, all their friends they talked to, was the lack of information about the candidates, because the candidates that they knew were the candidates who had the money to put the ads on TV, who made them recognizable, as opposed to maybe a better candidate who probably for a good reason didn't have the money and who wasn't beholden to some corporation or something. So I just wanted you to have that perspective. Yeah.
Super appreciate that. I think that helps us continue to understand like the limitations that we as voters have to engage whatever changes we want to make. It comes down to that education. It comes down to us being informed and knowing. And I think this is a good way to tie back to the ballot initiatives. The danger of ballot initiatives is that if we go to the masses to try to solve day-to-day problems, so many people will not be informed on the implications of this. And it becomes a purely emotional issue. And it can become a very expensive emotional issue. I think we look at California with the recall on the governor, and that whole process cost the state $300 million to do that for 66% victory for the current mayor. And it's not that everyone who voted for him is happy with him either, because of this duopoly and because of their frustration of the Democratic Party as well. But those are the choices we have, and it was such an expensive choice to make, to all of that work of community organizers and for organizations to inform voters around this. Because it was emotionally charged around why the recall was wanting to be pursued. And I think ballot initiatives can be helpful for reforming things, but I think to fix day-to-day solutions within a community, it's very tough, because this is why we have the representative democracy we have. We want people to be able to go into that space to learn all the details, and then to be able to vote that represents what their constituents value, because we need a liaison to dig into the content and dig into the materials. But yeah, that's not working that way either, right? Because we're not their constituents. It's corporations and people who have money who are the constituents. So yeah, very, very, very good conversation. This leads us to our last point. Before I do that, we did get a couple of comments. Ted is joining us on Facebook and has given us a couple of comments. He says, at least for the moment, there has been a major shift to the progressive end of the Democratic Party. Although he ran as a moderate, Biden has gotten more progressive. And so that was his feeling based on some of the things Biden has passed, which there are definitely some progressive wins that have happened, but the wins are like this compared to like, we need this. And so I think this is where that frustration is still with a lot of folks. And once again, going back to the duopoly, who's in the way of us passing rural reform? Fellow Democratic senators. And so this party is not aligned with serving the people as much as we think they are. It is still special interests. It is still, what's going to maximize their prosperity in terms of their position and everything. Ted also said he thinks that the Republican Party is preparing to end the duopoly if they can get away with it. And so essentially they want to have all the power, I just watched Lord of the Rings with my kids, so it makes me think of that one ring that rules them all, right? This is what the Republican Party is really going after. So that I can definitely see why he's making that comment there. Roy Flores joined us on Facebook, and he says get rid of qualified immunity as one of those measurements to be able to push back on corruption in politics. And qualified immunity means is a defense that the law enforcement and other government officials can raise in response to lawsuits seeking monetary damages for alleged civil rights violations. And so they have qualified immunity towards those charges. And so, yeah, I think that's one of those pieces that could be impactful.
That's cool. So it's basically indemnification.
Yeah, I think they get this little extra cover for being,
Yeah.
corrupt.
Oh God.
Crazy. I think we have one additional comment. Let me check here.
You know that
Let's
you
see.
muted. Okay, good.
Sorry. It looks like it's kind of stuck behind. Okay, it wasn't scrolling up for me and show me all the comments because Facebook is horrible. Ted says, don't forget the Voting Rights Bill of 1965 on the positive side, although it had a white supremacist backlash in Vietnam. So something when we were talking about the 60s that he wanted to share as well. So our last topic we want to talk about is the solution around how do we solve this? How do people get involved and solve this? And one of the big tenets is to invest in political innovation. And so when they talk about investing in political innovation, they kind of gave a couple of steps for people to take to be able to do that. First is to join an effort. To evangelize, join, found, and fund. So to evangelize, this information around the innovations that we're needing, which is, also helps them with getting their product across to the masses. So a little extra benefit there. Join an organization, join an effort so that you are part of the solution. So we definitely believe in that, be people participating, joining Indivisible TX Lege or joining other allied organizations to be a part of the work. There's definitely alignment with that. Found something if there isn't something in your community, develop something. So yeah, I'm with them on that as well. And then fund. And I think this is where we have a little bit of disagreements in terms of what is an acceptable solution. So they point to philanthropic successes and look to philanthropic institutions that have been able to do great work in terms of progress that maybe government or other people haven't been able to do. One of the reasons, let's say, government hasn't been able to do certain improvements is because the government didn't have the resources or the funds to be able to do those improvements because of tax cuts, which is why these foundations exist, because they were able to profit so much. And now they're the ones who are there saying, hey, somebody should fix this. I have the money to do that, but we're going to fix it my way. And so this is one of the fundamental problems with philanthropy is that they not only have the money, but they also have the control in terms of how we fix it. So it creates a different type of industry that can be corrupt as well as the politics industry. But there is still some truth in that, because this is the access to funds, that this is what funds Indivisible as an organization and a lot of organizations. So how do we leverage those funds to be able to do good work? And I think this is where, they talked a little bit about it needs to be local. So efforts need to be local. We need to be organizing locally because this is what matters. And I think this is a tried and true piece we've seen with school boards. There's nothing like your kids to motivate you to say, I need to get involved. And so across Texas, across the country, but especially in Texas, we've seen school boards attacked for misinformation around critical race theory, and we've seen them attacked for, protective measures against COVID, like mask mandates or things like that. And there's this anti-science, anti-public education, racist sector of our population that are going to school boards to attack anything they're trying to do. And so localized is something where we've seen a lot of people get plugged in and interested. But they talk about build a 4-constituency coalition, and it says grassroots members, which are organized local volunteers on the ground, grass tops supporters, which include donors, business and civic leaders and organizations, political leaders, and then prominent opinion leaders. I think ultimately this is the flaw I see with this philanthropic pursuit, is that if philanthropy is going to be the solution because they have the money and they supposedly want to do good, if that money is designed to help build a volunteer base, then that continues the exploitation model that has allowed them to amass so much money in the first place. And I think real investment is by investing in community organizers within our communities so that their talents, their time, their labor are properly compensated so that they can do the work, potentially become representatives of that community, potentially become elected officials of that community, or just be good, stable, sustainable partners in this fight for progress that we need. And if there is this marketplace solution that we need for the politics industry, with a third party as one example that's been mentioned, or something to compete against the duopoly that we have, we're not going to volunteer our way to that solution. We need real investment in people if we're going to have a real market solution so that they are the ones who can innovate, build those relationships, and organize in all kinds of ways, from school board to Congress and everywhere in between, so that their representation meets the values of the people and pursues the solutions that they want. And even with all of that, we still have the overall system that needs to be changed. And so eventually, if we get to where we're a multi-party country where there's 4, 5, 6 parties to represent the different priorities and perspectives of people, I think that'll ultimately also help us. So breaking this duopoly is one of the also end games in this. So wanted to give that perspective on those solutions and where I think there is agreement, but not how they think about it, and where there are some flaws, I think, in terms of their model and their recommendation.
Yes, so much agreement, so much. Oh man, there's a lot there. I really think we need to move away from, so I mean, it is kind of the Republican approach: small government, fill the gaps with charity, so that way everyone who has all the resources, all the wealth, they get to decide, what charity they want to. They like, oh, let's help these kids, let's help, this group, let's help this. And it's, like you said, it's just control. And so I don't like that solution at all. I don't like the billionaires being the ones to determine what we get. It's so in the book they say philanthropy isn't a substitute for effective government, which I completely agree with. And so, yeah, Alex, what you're talking about is, we need to see major shifts in resources through various ways. Of course, like getting rid of all these tax cuts for the wealthy, and so the government can play a role in shifting and closing that gap of inequality that we have. But in the meantime, we do have folks who have a lot of money, and some of them do want to support good things. And so I really like the mutual aid approach to things, where we don't have to go through organizations, charities, nonprofits as like the middle people who get to, kind of have that control of how different things are, but like literally just getting the money to the people, like what Alex was saying. So that's something I'd love to see a lot more, as kind of we, just have a situation we do where there are people who have a ton of money. Some of them want to help do the right thing. So I'd love to see us go in that direction, while also, of course, pushing for the government to address the severe inequality that we have that they created. So yeah, good stuff.
Well, Alex, you may remember from previous Facebook Live book discussions, I really don't like to use the word fix or solve. But one thing, sort of a couple of parting comments. One thing that just dawned on me when you think about the duopoly and a lot of the commentary that you're hearing right now about Republicans and the Republican Party is a slippery slope to actually dissolve the duopoly and make it into a monopoly. Think about that. You know, what we're talking about and what that book is about was about the duopoly. But what we're contending with here in real time is a potential transition, as a lot of people are describing it, basically from a duopoly to a monopoly, AKA authoritarian form of government. The other thing I'll comment about this, the authors mentioned this notion of political currency. One form of currency is money, the other is votes. The return on investment for people who put money into the duopoly is huge. And that is a powerful motivator to perpetuate the duopoly. The shift that this innovation seeks to promote is toward a greater and greater return on the voter side, where that return on investment by voters, or the return on investment is in the form of beneficial public policy. That return on investment right now is very small because of the structure of the duopoly. And so that's the imbalance. You know, the return on the investment is huge on one side by all of those players on each side of the duopoly, and it's very low on the currency side as far as, you know, Joe Schmo voter goes. And that's part of what these authors are trying to point out structurally about how the game's played by the rules, which seek to maintain that imbalance in a currency sense. It's a struggle.
It is a struggle, and the whole monopoly thing is terrifying me. And I guess this book, when I first read it, was part of my gung ho. I'm going to join every organization. I'm going to build Texas 2020. I'm going to change people's minds. And I thought more people knew and cared about politics than is possible. I mean, then I just thought I was more naive. And I just think I wish either we had mandatory elections or there was some kind of tax incentive or something that motivated people to pay attention. Because everywhere I go, on every plane or every Uber ride, I engage, and the most common thing is I'm just disgusted with politics. And I say, you know, your silence is a voice for the other side, you know, and why just don't pick sides? I said, by not picking, you're picking. And I think that is really what's having this country head towards a monopoly, is people putting their heads in the sand. And a book I just finished was After the Fall by Ben Rhodes. He was one of Obama's speechwriters. And the first part of the book is Hungary and how that happened. And then it goes into Russia and kind of how that happened when we thought we liberated Russia and everything. And then China and how Hong Kong and all that stuff is happening. And everything I see, it's like we're headed in that direction. And I keep trying to wake up all my friends and all my Uber drivers. But I just feel like we're either on the Titanic heading for the iceberg, or we're going to have to incentivize people to get out and paddle and change the direction. This book, I read it the first time thinking, yes, we can do this. And then the second time I read it, it was like, oh no, these are not viable solutions. So they're interesting. I guess I hope we can all come up with a solution. But I feel like if we don't incentivize people to pay attention, we will be a monopoly soon. And I wish I knew what it was, because I would do it. I'm sorry to end on a bummer note, but
No, I think it's absolutely, we need to keep it real for everyone that we're not in a good place right now. We're not in a good place in Texas. We are an organization that works to try to push for positive legislation to stop horrible legislation. And this has been the worst year in terms of trying to do that. We've had, there's always been bad legislation that's passed since we've been involved and before, but this is some of the most toxic legislation, the most harmful legislation that has passed and that continues to be pursued. And I think this is why Reader Corner has become such a piece of what we want to do as an organization, because education is so important. I think, Gina, your awakening and all of our awakenings, whenever they happened, in our lives, was because we became educated about something. We became aware, and then we were able to learn, and then we were able to grow, and then we were able to actually do work that could make an impact. And that is making impacts. And at the fundamental piece of this, and them teaching what the politics industry is in the first half of the book, and then them giving their perspective in terms of some solutions, we do have this gap in understanding and education. And the concern is, collectively, are we too ignorant to come together to actually overcome this? Are we
lazy, not ignorance?
Well, no, I definitely think it's both. There's some laziness in terms of some apathy. I think I would call it apathy in some cases, and in some cases, it's just our people are overburdened because of the oppression of poverty and the oppression of racism. They're working their asses off, and they don't have like the time to figure out this problem. They're trying to figure out the problem to get food on the table and stuff, things like that, or raise their family or things like that. And so, but I think it is a collective ignorance. We actually don't know we don't know how this works. We don't know how government works. We don't know how elections work, and we don't know how to solve it. And I think that is a collective ignorance we as a people have. And I think that is directly tied to our education system, right? Our education system, that we spend so many hours involved in our youth, and through the first, 18 to 20 years, or however long people were able to spend in education, is supposed to be designed to help us navigate the world as it is. And it just doesn't do that. And we saw our legislative body this year try to weaken education by not talking about history, not talking about race, not talking about current events, not trying to tie it to where we in our conversation tied our current environment to the Gilded Age. Teachers are being disincentivized to do that, and to be able to see that. And so we have elected leaders who want us to be as dumb as possible so that they can continue to have power. And we need to collectively understand we have a burden of learning and education that we have to do, which is, I'm excited about the work we're doing, because this is exactly where we're transitioning with our Texas tour. How does this book affect our work? How does this environment affect our work? We're going to hit the road, and we're going to be going to communities all throughout Texas to do an education effort, organizing effort, connect with their neighbors with deep canvassing, to continue to try to contribute towards solutions. But do we have enough time? Do we have enough resources to overcome this collective ignorance that we unfortunately have gotten to as a people in this country? That's the big question. I'm going to keep pushing personally to push for those solutions. And I know everyone here on this panel and everyone who organizes an Indivisible TX Lege with our allies are committed to it as well. And I think it's an opportunity for me as a father to be able to look at my daughters, for my wife and I to be able to look at our daughters, to be able to say, we're doing this to represent and show the values that we say we want you to live by and that we want you to learn. This is what it looks like. And so hopefully collectively, if we do enough of that, we can overcome this. And this is the big wild card. human ingenuity, human capacity, our ability as humans, we are game changers. And so this is the big hope, that we just have enough of that to really change this unfortunate situation we're in.
That's a positive place to end.
I agree. Yep.
Thank you for
Let's end
that.
it there.
I
Thank
need
Well,
it.
thanks. Thanks, y'all. Thanks for your time. Thanks for reading this book. If you haven't read this book and you watch this, we encourage you to read it, have a conversation with us in the comments on Facebook or YouTube. And we're going to keep chipping away. This is what we do. See you.